welcome everybody. This is a very exciting webinar for us because we've got somebody that is a very close friend of New Zealand and is very generous of his time, the Chief Executive Officer of the Centre for New American Security, Richard Fontaine. I'll introduce him in shortly. But we also have Fran O'Sullivan, who's the foremost columnist in foreign policy matters and other business issues with us, and she's chair of the advisory committee of the New Zealand-US Council. And with us, will be joining us shortly, will be Stuart Wilson from NDACE and Sam McIver. So those are the four panelists. And of course, my name's Leon Grice, and I'm the chair of the New Zealand-US Council. Now, topic today that we've asked Richard to cover is Trump 2 or Biden 1, which President Trump this week was talking about 12 more years, so it could be the first of 4 terms, the second of 4 terms, and then we've got Biden being 1. But in some ways, you know, the question is this going to be Biden 1 or an extension of Obama? Is it Obama 3? But the key for us is our focus is what does it mean for New Zealand and the Indo-Pacific, and so we're going to be talking foreign policy, trade, and security today. So it's we've got a lot to cover. And so I'm going to ask shortly Richard to do a brief survey of where he thinks the issues are, and then we'll delve into a range of issues that our panelists will bring forward. But before we do that, I should properly introduce Richard. He's a friend of New Zealand's. As I said before, he's always very generous of his time. And he started off as a staffer in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then he moved to the State Department and was Deputy Secretary for South Asia, which is a very significant role. And then he moved from there to the National Security Council and George W. Bush's presidency in the Asia Directorate. And then he became the foreign policy advisor to the late, great Senator John McCain. And then in 2012, he moved to become the president of the CNAS, the Center for New American Security. And in the last year, 18 months, he's been acting as chief executive officer. Well, not an acting, he is the chief executive officer of the Center for of New American Security. So welcome, it's fantastic to have you here today. That's a long introduction, Richard, but how come you look so young when you got so much experience?
Zoom does amazing things. Transmit images across the ocean. If you could see more closely, you would see that. But thank you, Jordan, for that kind introduction and for having me. And it's great to be with you and with Fran, Leon. And the only thing that would be better is if we could do this in person.
Yeah, that's true.
But such is the world we live in, and so I'm really happy to be with all of you. I'll give just a bit of an overview of how I see a few of the things shaping up in terms of the race and what might come next, whether it's Biden 1 or Trump 2 and all of that on some of the big issues, just for a few minutes, and then we can get into a discussion about whatever you would like to, whatever aspect appeals to you. But so just looking at the race at this point, so obviously we have an election on November 3rd, so we've got a little bit more than 2 months to go. When you look at the polls, the place to go is the Real Clear Politics national average, takes all of the polls and continues to move the average around based on new polls coming out and things like that. So if you look at the poll today, the poll average today, Real Clear Politics, Joe Biden is up over Donald Trump by 7.1%. It's down a little bit over the last month, but it's still a healthy lead. But to give you a perspective, on October 27th, 2016, which is 4 years ago in this hemisphere, I know it's the next day for you guys right now, but on August 27th, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton had a 6.3% lead over Donald Trump in the Real Clear Politics average. And what happened was the polls tightened, and her lead went down to 2 or 3. It then grew again in the first 3 weeks of October of 2016, back out to about where it had been, tightened up right for the end, and then of course Trump won on election day. And the thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the polling numbers don't tell the whole story. Hillary Clinton won almost 3 million more votes than Donald Trump on election day, but Trump won the Electoral College, and that's how you win the presidency in our system, and that's what matters, and that's what will matter this time. It's almost inconceivable that Donald Trump will win the popular vote. It is conceivable that he can win the Electoral College. And so, you look at those who are sort of handicapping the race, and they say 70% chance on Biden and 30% on Trump, but, who knows? And even if you look at the calendar, it looks like the election's sort of right around the corner, but it's a lot of time left in politics between now and election day, and anything is possible. And 2020 has been nothing but surprises, to say the least. And so what happens between now and then is pretty uncertain. Here in the United States, in policy and political circles, there are a whole lot of people who are counting out Donald Trump and preparing for a Biden victory, and the sort of inevitable political logic that will enable it. But I guess I'm old enough to remember 4 years ago when people were doing virtually the same thing with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So to me, the race is very much a live one. It looks like Biden's got the better shot at it, but every caveat applies. Last week the Democrats held their national convention virtually, of course. Nobody convened, and the Republicans are having theirs this week. A number of Republicans have come out in support of Joe Biden's candidacy this week, and in full disclosure, I should note that I am one of those who has done so and crossed party lines to support Joe Biden. And it's an interesting Republican convention, which tells you a little bit about the state of conventions in general in the United States, and a little bit about where the parties are. So the Democratic Party had a traditional platform that they negotiated and released, and really the issues there were the foreign policy, national security issues were fairly straightforward because they were not subject to the push and pull on the economic and domestic issues that where you had sort of the Bernie Sanders and sort of left wing of the party, and then you had the Biden sort of wing of the party, and they were trying to pull back and forth and make sure everybody was on the same page. They actually had convened unity, they call them unity forum or something like this, that were Bernie Sanders representatives and Biden representatives that were and they put out a long document about how they could come on the same page and work together on a whole bunch of issues. It did not include foreign policy and national security. That just was not even touched. And so the push and pull really was on the domestic and economic side. On the national security and foreign policy side, that was pretty straightforward. The Republican side, for the first time in the 160-year history of the Republican Party since its founding, there is no platform this year. There is no Republican platform in 2020. Rather than write and issue a platform, the Republicans this year decided to have just a general resolution of support for the Trump administration and its agenda, and a general resolution that Trump should be reelected. So different times politically than we've seen more recently. And again, it tells you a little bit about something about the Republican Party and about the future uncertainty of the party, and we can talk a little bit about that later if folks are interested. Before that, though, I thought I'd run through just a few of the differences that I think we're likely to see in the foreign policy approaches of a Trump 2-term or a Biden 1-term. The first, and maybe the most interesting, is policy toward China. The bottom line is that the approach on both sides is very different than the typical Republican or Democratic administration would have had even 4 or 5 years ago. The positions on China have hardened very quickly for a whole variety of reasons over the last 3-4 years, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, more so on the Republican side, but a lot of the national security folks on the Democratic side look with great skepticism at China and think that the previous engagement strategy has sort of run its course, and that a fundamentally competitive strategy is what we need to embrace right now. This, of course, has become actually part of the presidential campaign, where it really hadn't been for a number of years, where Trump is running on being tough on China, getting tough with them on trade and all these other things, and saying Biden will be weak and can't do it if he's elected. Biden's hitting Trump saying, well, he's being confrontational without being competitive, he's ineffective in his pushback and all of this stuff. So what I think this adds up to in terms of policy is, irrespective of who's elected, you're not going to see a return to the sort of engagement first approach, the responsible stakeholder, the idea that maybe through economic engagement and information flows, then China's foreign policy will mellow and it may even become more liberal domestically. I think those kind of hopes are more or less out the window. The question, of course, is what replaces that, and I think what it replaces it is a competitive set of strategies on both sides. Trump's would be more confrontational, but I think Biden still would be less overtly confrontational, but still fairly competitive. Trump would go for a phase 2 deal on trade. I think if Biden comes in, he tries to use the leverage that Trump has put into place on the sanctions, but actually reorient some of the priorities, less buy American soybeans and autos and more other things like theft of intellectual property, things like that. Lots of sanctions for lots of different things. Biden is now calling what's happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs genocide. That's a pretty strong term. And that opens expectations that they will do something about it. Both sides, you would see, I think, defense emphasis on the Indo-Pacific first and foremost. Again, a change from where we used to focus on the greater Middle East to a great extent, but less resources, as I'll get into in a second. And then, preempting the natural question that comes from anyone from New Zealand, I think there is a chance that Biden would get back into the TPP in some way, shape, or form. I don't think Trump has got much interest in this, but he's also unpredictable across the board, so who knows. On defense, I think budgets come down both under Biden and Trump, but they come down more under Biden than they would under Trump. Both would see a shift away from legacy platforms and toward new investments in technology and missiles and unmanned systems and autonomous systems and things like that. Both of them are likely to have a China first strategy, deprioritizing large-scale operations in the greater Middle East. They'll still do counterterrorism operations. Both of them want troops out of Afghanistan, but actually, maybe counterintuitively, I think Trump is got a more sort of momentum around bringing troops out of Afghanistan, irrespective of what comes next, than Biden would. So a few differences there, but some similarities. On trade, it's a pretty protectionist moment in U.S. politics, and all of you who watch this stuff know that we go sort of up and down in waves, depending on all kinds of things about how the economy is doing and everything else. As recently as 2012, Mitt Romney was criticizing Barack Obama for being insufficiently aggressive in trade liberalization, saying he had left too many opportunities on the table. He hadn't used his first term effectively to strike deals. Now, of course, Romney lost. And then, of course, in the second term of the Obama administration, they tried to push through a number of things, including TPP. But Trump is a protectionist. I mean, he makes no bones about the fact that he's a protectionist. He likes tariffs. That's his weapon of choice. He wants bilateral trade deals, not multilateral ones. Thinks that the United States is in a stronger position, sitting across from a country that, by definition, will be smaller than the United States in economic terms than a whole bunch of 11 countries or something like that. But the evidence that we have so far is not exactly inspiring. I mean, the China phase 1 trade deal is not really delivered. China is way under the commitments it's made in terms of purchases of U.S. products, even if what you care about is what the president cares about, which is the trade deficit. I think most experts, and I think to some degree the Biden administration, would say, hey, look, it's not actually the trade deficit. It's the number one issue that we've got with China. It's these other things like unfair investment rules and theft of intellectual property and forced technology transfer and subsidies to state-owned enterprises and these other things, which are harder, by the way, to deal with. And so I think you're likely to see a divergence in the priorities that the two administrations would set in terms of what they try to achieve in terms of trade and things like that. And of course, there are ongoing trade talks with Japan and India and other countries as well. And, I think if Trump wins, he keeps pushing those. If Biden wins, I think their instinct is going to be to apply a do no harm principle to most of those, off the bat. So, I think President Biden would probably be more open to trade deals like TPP. Of course, he was the one who was selling it at the end of the Obama administration. It's almost inconceivable that he could sell it to the Congress as is, given the number of people who said that this is like so problematic, it could never pass as is and stuff. So the question is, are there alterations of some way? Is there something you can do to make it politically palatable? That conversation really hasn't taken place yet, but the fact that it's at least theoretically possible to me is encouraging. And I think, now that we're 4 years into this, the idea that we were going to strike a bunch of bilateral trade deals across the Indo-Pacific, that has not panned out. We don't have one with India. We don't have one with Japan. We've renegotiated the Korean one for the second time, and that doesn't really count. The Philippines, we don't have one. Vietnam, we don't have one. And so what we're left with is a situation where there's two big regional trade agreements. There's, RCEP and TPP, and the U.S. is party to neither. And that doesn't feel very good. And then last issue I'll just touch on very briefly is on technology. What you're seeing is a sort of a circling of the wagons around technology issues and some decoupling of US and China. I mean, you can read the news and see the stuff on TikTok and all these other things are making the news. But behind that, you're seeing a lot of momentum in the government, which I think has a decent amount of support on the Democratic side, especially in Congress, around putting more export controls, investment regulations, things like that to protect America's technology edge and to try to ensure that technology edge doesn't bleed away toward China. The Biden administration, if there is one, I think would pursue a multilateral approach to some of this. They've talked about having a kind of a tech alliance with something that I'm writing a foreign affairs article here about with a colleague of mine, and I know that there's been interest both in the State Department under the Trump administration and in the Biden administration about what something like that might look like and things. But you're really seeing a kind of a pullback and a protection around the technology sphere that you saw much less of before. So final thing I'll just say before we get to the discussion is, okay, well, where do the parties go from here? And if you know the answer to that question, please let me know in the Q&A period, because I don't know. I mean, the Democratic Party, I think, it was sort of tested when Bernie Sanders came quite close to getting the nomination. And then we saw how the establishment really closed around Biden as the centrist alternative to the left wing. And they did so in a pretty impressive way. So the big question is really on the Republican side, and all of that really turns on whether Donald Trump is reelected or not. And if he is, the party remains the Trump party, a party without a platform other than generalized support for him, this kind of a populist, movement almost. And if not, then it will be, if he's not elected, then it'll be a battle for the soul of the party between some of the populist forces or sort of Trump-like forces that say, hey, the Mitt Romneys and the John McCains may have been nice guys, but they didn't win. And Donald Trump did, and he did so with a different makeup of a constituency than was traditional on the Republican side. And then more Republican, I don't know what you would call them, mainstream or traditionalists, or from where I come from on foreign policy, internationalists that have a more traditional view of the values that drove the party in the first place. But the onus is going to be on them to show that stuff can get elected, because, of course, it's the case that since 1992, a Republican has won the popular vote for the presidency in the United States only one time, and that was in 2004 when George W. Bush got more votes than John Kerry. So there's this overarching issue, not only about what does the party stand for, but what does the party stand for that can win elections? Mm. And we'll know more after November 3rd on that one. So anyway, some ideas up front, but I look forward to the discussion. Thanks again for having me.
I have one quick question before we ask Fran to ask her questions, and that goes to what kind of people are going to be in a Trump administration, what kind of people are going to be in a Biden administration after an election. Do you have a sense of that? Because those people they tend to be working in the campaigns, and who do you think are the key ones on both sides that are likely to emerge?
Well, on the Biden side, there's a lot. In the foreign policy groups that they have, which they've now closed entry to officially, there's almost 2,000 people.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of people available for service if asked to come to Washington. And I think you see, in terms of names and things like that, you see the kinds of, foreign policy experts that have been around toward the end of the Obama administration and things like that. So, the folks like Tom Donilon and Susan Rice and Samantha Power and Michelle Flournoy and, Jake Sullivan and people like that. The Trump side actually is a lot harder to predict because, one, I mean, if you rewound the clock and we were sitting in 2016 and you said, okay, I'm going to tell you with 100% certainty there will be a Republican administration, now pick the cabinet officers, you're very unlikely to have said Robert O'Brien will be the national security advisor, and you would have had Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State, and then Mike Pompeo, and then the Secretaries of Defense that we've had. I mean, it's been not traditional folks in most cases, and so it is an open question. And I think actually a lot of the folks on the Trump side who are currently in those positions are likely to, say, okay, I did my time at break time, and they're going to have to restock the pond with new folks. But who those new folks? I mean, some will be internal people that rise up. So, and then there will be others who pulled in from outside and things like that. But the combination of, the rule of no Democrats, no civil servants, and no Republicans who have ever criticized Donald Trump means that the pool is not infinite, shall we say, of people to draw from.
Yeah. Fran, do you want to take the helm? Oh, we can't hear you, Fran, so you might have to unmute.
Sorry.
Here we go.
No, it's all right. Thank you for running us through the different approaches with Trump and Biden toward China. I'm interested, however, further on the commonality, and you've talked about this, what Joe Biden has talked about, almost like this technology front and like-minded countries to confront China in these areas, particularly around IP protection and so on. What if you can't get movement out of Beijing, however? I mean, is this going to lead to bifurcating of supply chains, technology, platforms, all of that? Or just is there a process where you think both sides will come together?
No, I don't think that there is a process. It's very unlikely. And so what you're going to see, and you're already seeing, is some decoupling of the technology sphere of the U.S. and China economies. There's a lot of talk about broader decoupling of the U.S. and China economies, which I just don't think is realistic. I mean, I think the cost to the United States would be vast, and you'll see things on the margins here or there with respect to supply chains. I mean, Americans woke up and realized that a large number of their pharmaceuticals and medical equipment was made outside the United States, which didn't seem suddenly great when we had a global pandemic, and a significant portion of that was made in China. And so you see some diversification of supply chains and resourcing, and I don't think you'll see a huge amount of reshoring, but you'll see some changing. But technology is the one where I think you'll see by far the most, both because you'll see government activity aimed specifically at protecting American technology and blocking Chinese technology, or blocking a Chinese investment in American technology and things like that, through the CFIUS process and the Commerce Department's entities list and things like that. And again, you've already seen a number of those steps. And you will see other countries doing this too. I mean, so, India is now, blocking Chinese apps after their border skirmish and things like that. So that is in some ways the fulcrum around which I think a lot of the competitive nature of this is going to play out. And it's very difficult to see the United States and China sitting down and coming to an agreement that, I don't know, they won't hold the data of Americans that flow over Chinese platforms or whatever, and do so in a way that's credible to the United States, to those who are actually worried about this kind of stuff. I mean, the sort of thought experiment is, are there steps that Huawei could do that would make Americans comfortable with Huawei building out our 5G network? And I think the answer to that is no. I mean, the Huawei said, well, but it would be operated in a foreign country by that nationals of that country, and the information would flow over networks that are physically located in that country, and so forth. And those things just don't get far enough to overcome the worries that at least American policymakers have about the sanctity of information that's flowing over Chinese-owned networks, whether it's digital platforms or 5G and telecom and stuff like that.
Yeah, you mentioned also in terms of TPP that Biden might seek to join that. Li Keqiang has already expressed interest in doing so, of course. Do you think that will add sufficient competitive tension to push a Biden-led US toward regional engagement through trade?
I mean, I hope so. It's hard to say, though, because the Obama administration got seared pretty badly. I mean, all of the economic and geopolitical compulsion behind TPP was there, but the domestic politics wasn't. And I mean, part of the lesson of this is don't wait till the final week of an 8-year administration to try to push something through your legislature. And you have a lot more strength in your first term than you would otherwise. But what the Biden administration is going to have to do is decide where this sits in their list of priorities. They're going to come in and say, we want changes on taxes. We want to do stuff on pandemics. We want to do stuff on healthcare. We want to do stuff on climate change. We want to do stuff on, you can pick all of these different things, most of which are going to require legislation, all of which are going to require spending political capital if they're going to have a shot at getting it done. Where does TPP fall on that list? Is it high, medium, or low? Right now, it's probably low. But, if they can get momentum on some of these other issues, and if it looks like, some Republicans kind of break their way on TPP, and it looks like, China's making the compulsion to do this a little more acute, I hope that together can sort of build some momentum behind this.
Mm-hmm. Just one final quick question, if I can. There's been a lot of a focus on various papers out of the Wilson Centre, almost suggesting New Zealand is a complete hotbed of PRC activity, and a lot of our business people are kind of aligned with that, and former politicians and so on. What's your view on how New Zealand is seen in the, within the competitive sphere of US and China?
I mean, I don't see New Zealand, well, I guess I tend to see it more as a test bed for what might, or what the potential for Chinese influence to be in a West-leaning democratic country that wants to choose its own foreign policy and course in the world. I mean, Australia is going through the same thing in a different way, but both New Zealand and China are subject to Chinese political influence, economic influence, if not coercion, public information sorts of campaigns, these various things that you guys know better than I do, in a way that the United States is not, but that the United States is quite worried about. To me, that heightens the imperative for the United States and New Zealand to work together on some of these issues, rather than let any of these things drive us further apart or to suspect one another or something like that. So I guess that's how I see it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. Richard, I do have a China question. Was it you that wrote in the Atlantic that China has squandered its opportunity to at this point? Yeah, and
that was me.
Yeah, and because it's bared its teeth and in terms of Hong Kong and a whole range of other issues. Do you still hold that view? Do you think they still have positioned themselves poorly in the last year or so?
Well, in less than last year. So basically, my argument was, in foreign policy circles, we always kind of batted around this idea. So, imagine that China could sort of walk astride the world stage as the global leader without the United States around for a while. It's just, what would it do? What does it want? What's its agenda? Would it have kind of an enlightened self-interest agenda, and it wants to kind of build global order, help other countries, bring them on their side, or would it be this kind of cramped vision of national interest that seeks above and all to make sure that China doesn't get criticized anywhere? And we more or less have run that experiment over the first 6 or 8 months of this year, because the United States has been virtually absent from various, the G7 and the G20. It just hasn't really been a leader. For some reasons that are obvious and some reasons that are intrinsic to the current administration, it's been very, very inwardly looking, not particularly leading other countries toward any sort of shared objective. And so that's created this huge opportunity, this kind of vacuum of international activity. And China came out of the pandemic, first, even though it started there, came out of it first, and its economy was damaged less than certainly North America and Europe. And so it had this great opportunity, and so you look at kind of how it used it, and it grabbed Hong Kong, it doubled down on the Uyghurs and its treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang. It got into a border skirmish that left a couple dozen Indians dead, and really sort of soured sentiment in India. It started pretty aggressive patrols around the Senkakus, and I think heightened even more the suspicions of the Japanese about Chinese intentions. In Europe, the quintessential example, the Netherlands renamed its office in Taipei, and the Chinese threatened to not send them medical supplies in response. And this kind of bully diplomacy, I think, has done two things. One, it's actually changed policy in a number of areas. So, the UK went from saying 5G, Huawei can build out the periphery, to 5G, Huawei can't build out the periphery. Japan has established an investment fund for the reshoring of Japanese businesses from the mainland China to Japan. India banned Chinese apps where, they had a decent market share and things like that. And so in that sense, they've sort of, saved us from ourselves in a way, because I do think they squandered the opportunity. That said, it's pretty small solace for two reasons. One, what is happening now is not going to be what happens forever. And two, I think there are areas where there are different explanations for why China's taken the different steps it has over the last 6 or 8 months. And some of which I think were genuinely self-defeating. But if you look, for example, at Hong Kong, compare it to Russia and Crimea a few years ago. So Russia grabs Crimea. This is an international outrage. It galvanizes, rhetorical outrage, sanctions. The U.S. and Europe are on the same page. We will not let this stand. We will not recognize this. You fast forward to now, the sanctions are still in place, and people aren't quite as outraged as they were before. The more pragmatic mind, they're saying, well, hey, look, we got to live in the world where it is, the world as it is. Are we gonna not deal with Russia forever because of this? We don't recognize Crimea, but Russia still got Crimea. So fast forward, a few years, and China's still going to have Hong Kong, and the tempers will have cooled and things like that. And I think that's what they're betting on, is that they can endure some long-term, some short-term, inflamed sentiment, because they're gonna win what they want over the long run in some of these cases. So I guess my point is, I think they've squandered their opportunity, but you can't rest on that laurel and think like, oh, okay, we don't have work to do here. Yeah.
So let's keeping slightly on that theme, but moving to Stuart Wilson. Now, Stuart runs a company called Endace. Endace does cybersecurity for very sophisticated network organizations. Sells all around the world. So cybersecurity and what's happening in technology around the world is really important. So, Stuart, do you want to ask your questions for Richard, please?
Hi, Richard. Nice to talk to you. How are you?
Hey.
It's interesting listening to the discussion around China and the US, China and the West, really. And the nationalist sentiment is easy to see, and the loss of intellectual property, and the purported nation-based attacks as well. And that's very easy to position as A versus B. But I was wondering, there doesn't appear to be much discussion around silicon production, especially in Taiwan. And, you know, Apple has silicon production in Taiwan. Other companies around the world do as well, but I don't see a lot of discussion around that particular pivot point. I was just wondering if you could discuss what your views on that particular issue is.
Yeah, it's a great question, and in Washington, there's more talk about that than you might think. And in fact, I was speaking with the Taiwanese ambassador last week about that, and at CNAS, we are planning actually to run a war game that's going to look at Taiwanese semiconductor production and you know, the interests of the U.S. and like-minded countries and things like that, and what are the threats to it and things like that. And you know, there's a couple of issues related to semiconductor production in Taiwan. I mean, one is the intellectual property side and things like that, but the other is the drain of potential talent to the mainland for higher salaries and things like that. And I think the Taiwanese are just starting to wrestle with the idea that, you know, if they got to the point where their fabrication facilities moved from Taiwan to the mainland China for cost and talent reasons, that's a very different situation, and it's a very different situation in terms of who is going to buy their exports, or who's going to buy those chips that are exported. So there's a lot of I would say concern, or at least thought about, you know, what are the various potential threats to the Taiwanese semiconductor industry, and how do we kind of get a handle on it, you know, in support of the Taiwanese and so forth, and also within the broader context of international semiconductor production. So you're talking about, you know, Japan and South Korea and the Netherlands and the United States, and you know, do we need sort of an international fab consortium that, or something like that, you know, to the kind of resources you would need to build a new fabrication facility is what, $20 billion or something. It's not cheap, but there's a lot of talk about the security of semiconductor supply chains, and even more than that, in semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So I don't know. We talk a decent amount about that these days, but it's a relatively new. You're right in that it's a relatively new subject on the sort of foreign policy agenda.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because we have to take supply chain security extremely seriously, and it's the reason I'm asking is just trying to get some insight into where that might head. So, you know, and I agree, it's probably going to become a more of a topic of discussion, probably more than we could discuss on an open forum like this.
Yeah, I mean, so there's obviously, you know, proprietary and classified aspects of this, but one of my colleagues, Martin Rasser, has been writing quite recently about semiconductor supply chains and these kinds of things. So if you're interested, he's got some very recent work out on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. And once again, thanks for taking the time to talk with us all. Thanks, Leon.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And we move now to Sam McIver, Beef and Lamb, which is all about innovation on farm and overseas as well. So, and Beef and Lamb has been very active in the area of trade. And so I'll hand it to Sam. You've got some of the questions we've been touching on TPP, but I'm sure you've got other questions around trade before we'll go to some of the questions that we've got from the broader audience.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and thank you for your insight. I guess a little bit of background in terms of New Zealand. We're one of the most exposed nations in the world to trade. We as a sector export 90% of what we produce, and predominantly in three theatres. In the Asia theatre, dominated by China, in North America, dominated by the US, and then into Europe as well. So you've alluded to some of the trade issues, particularly with China. I'm interested in sort of a number of angles. Firstly, North America, what's happened with MCA and how is that actually playing out? For the two candidates, what will their approaches be around Europe? Thirdly, what will their approaches be around ongoing protection for domestic industries, and what impact does that have? And then really the fourth one is the WTO. So New Zealand has been very well served, I guess, by ongoing trade liberalisation globally and by a rules-based system. And by all accounts and observations, that's a little bit under threat. So I'm really interested, I guess, in your candidates' ongoing views of the WTO and approaches to that.
You said MCA and WTO. What were 2 and 3?
Europe, and ongoing domestic protectionism.
Okay.
Or support, whichever way you want to describe it.
Yeah. Let me try to hit those. So on MCA, I mean, ultimately, it was a fairly cosmetic set of changes. The president both insisted that he had previously he routinely described NAFTA as the great rape of America and the worst deal ever negotiated, and those other kinds of things, and threatened to pull the United States out, which would have, to say the least, have been quite bad. And so going into the MCA negotiations, what happened was the United States negotiators actually negotiated it with Mexico more or less bilaterally, and then gave the Canadians, something like 48 hours basically to sign on. Now the Mexicans had been briefing the Canadians throughout the process, but it was not a finest moment in North American allied politics, shall we say. And but strangely, the TPP, which the president rejected as horrible and terrible and all these other things, was the source of most of the updated language for the updated chapters in USMCA. So, there are chapters that are actually more protectionist in USMCA slightly than was the case in NAFTA when it comes to some of the rules of origin on autos and stuff like that. Which, as a free trader, I think is a step backwards, but it's a relatively small step backwards. NAFTA didn't have any language on digital trade. Now it does, and USMCA does. But where'd they get that? They got from the supposedly unacceptable TPP language. But Trump had the ultimate Trump card, no pun intended, with both Canada, Mexico, and the Congress by saying, well, if you don't like this deal, then I'm going to pull out of NAFTA and we'll have no deal at all. So, and that was sort of the nuclear option. So, USMCA is there and it just is what it is. It's just kind of, so that's that. And I don't think there's really a whole lot more. I mean, there's subsidiary issues, which actually get into your question about domestic protectionism, like, tariff on steel and aluminum, not pursuant to anything in USMCA, but pursuant to the national security, rationale under the GATT, which, had always been a taboo sort of thing. And on its face, just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And administrations had never wanted to use it because they saw it as a slippery slope by which, by God, if you can say that, imports of, and actually they were talking about using it for to block imports of German autos, which, it's just kind of amazing. But, once we say that about X, any country can say that about Y, so they haven't done it. But that gives you a sense, more than anything, of where the president thinks a key part of his base is and what state those. It's politics, not economics, and so there's always domestic protectionism, but to see it manifested as invoking the national security exclusion was pretty disappointing, I think. I think if the Biden administration comes in, I really doubt they'll use the national security thing in the same way that Trump did. They're just more sensitive to how these things play out over time. I think also with the WTO, the Trump administration has taken this kind of strangulation approach to the dispute resolution mechanism and the judges there and things like that, which again was like no American that you ever stop in the street would know that this is like actually happening. This is like wonky international bureaucratic stuff, but it actually really matters. And I think you wouldn't see that kind of approach out of the Biden administration just because that's not their instinct. So, I think there would be generally more support for the WTO and things like that. But there is an overarching question. And so I guess my bottom line here is that if Trump wins, I don't think he changes his disposition on trade. I mean, if the guy has been consistent on one thing for 30 years, it's been opposition to trade deals. I mean, he was taking out full-page ads in the New York Times in 1994, 1995, saying NAFTA is the worst deal in the world and all this other stuff. And I mean, he wasn't a politician at the time. He just kind of did that. His core belief appears to be that trade deficits, the health of an economic relationship is measured by a trade deficit. The United States has a trade surplus good, trade deficit is bad, and the amount of the trade deficit means the amount of money that is owed to the United States by country X. I mean, there's like goods that travel in the other direction and stuff, but whatever. So I think that will continue to be the general kind of approach. The Biden approach actually would be trickier in some ways because, the Democratic Party is not a traditionally free trade party. We're at a protectionist moment. And as I was saying before, they're going to have to decide where pushing something like TPP or any other trade agreement stands in their list of priorities, which is pretty long right now, and it has a whole lot of domestic items. And they want to overturn a lot of the things the Trump administration did, and that overturned a lot of the things the Obama administration did. So that I think is just kind of uncertain, but I think the disposition out of the Biden team would be different.
Thank you.
Hey, so do you think Bob Lighthizer will get a second term? Do you think he wants to go again?
I have no idea. That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah,
I would tell you if I did, but I don't.
Okay. We've got questions from the floor, but before we do that, I think we'll tack back to one of the questions that Stuart asked around silicon. And where do you see both potential presidents moving to sort of geostrategically with Taiwan? Like, are we in a boiling frog issue with Hong Kong and Xinjiang and then Taiwan has just become another Crimea is the question.
Yeah, two things are happening with Taiwan simultaneously that seem almost contradictory. On the one hand, China's attempts to influence the politics and the economics of Taiwan have only grown, and of course its ability to make a grab militarily for the island if it ever chose to do so has significantly increased over the last few years, given the kinds of investments that it's made in its force structure and things. At the same time, Taiwan has some of the taboo has come off of dealing with Taiwan as an entity. I mean, you certainly that is true in Washington, and I think that's a product of less sensitivity to how angry China might get on anything because we have so many issues that we're angering each other about. Part of that is such a sharp contrast between what's happening in Hong Kong and what's happening in Taiwan. Part of that is just even over the past few months, I mean, the contrast between Taiwan as an effective response to the pandemic and a genuinely flourishing Chinese democracy alongside China, where, that tried to cover up the pandemic for a while, get a handle on it through rather autocratic means, blame the United States about it, the whole kind of thing. And then, clearly is continue to move in a more autocratic fashion. And so what you see is, as long ago as the transition period when President-elect Trump spoke to President Tsai on the phone, this was a big deal, broke a bunch of taboos. And, we had the our Secretary of Health and Human Services went over to Taiwan last week, and didn't really make that many waves. The sort of standard China complaining and things like that. I think the biggest issue actually is less, China trying to seize the island by force, although you can never exclude that possibility. But China trying increasingly to influence the politics of Taiwan in a way that circumscribes essentially freedom of expression in that country, so that, it did not work this time. And if anything, I think the Hong Kong grab really helped President Tsai, because, nobody wanted anything that smelled or looked like one country, two systems. But, in the long game, given the degree of cross-border economic integration, now China has a lot of levers for economic coercion. Certainly diplomatically, it's gone around to pick off the remaining countries that are recognized Taiwan and things like that. And I think, and Xi Jinping has made noises that, this shall not last forever, which before the assumption was that, it pretty much could last forever. And so where all that brings Taiwan and China, I think, is uncertain. But I think the sentiment toward Taiwan is hardier now than it has been at any point in my career.
Right. Now we've got a few more questions from the audience. I think Steph Honey asks a really a good one, which we haven't touched on, which is the Biden presidency's approach to climate change and the environment. What actions do you expect the Biden administration to follow on that, particularly with Kamala Harris having that as an important plank in her own campaign?
Well, they've made clear they're going to get back into the Paris Accord on day one, so you'll see that reversal. This will be a top priority for the Biden administration. A lot of this, not a lot, well, a lot of it has to do with domestic issues. I mean, the Trump administration has spent the last 3.5 or so years overturning a whole lot of Obama-era regulations, including environmental regulations. And I think the Biden folks will come in and try to overturn what Trump has done and put back into place those regulations. And, overall, you will see, I think, an aggressive posture toward international cooperation, some effort to try to exclude this from the scope of U.S.-China competition, to say, hey, look, this is one of the few areas where we really should be trying to cooperate with China, although I haven't really yet seen what that means in practice. More investments into technology and things like that. I think what you're unlikely to see is something like a cap and trade system, because it requires legislation out of the Congress, and that just has fallen short time and time, or even a carbon tax. The kind of big movements that would do this, but certainly on things like fuel efficiency and things like that. All of the regulatory stuff that they can do as an executive, I think you're going to see pretty quick and pretty aggressive movement in the green direction.
Okay, and we've got a question that Ruben Staff is going to ask, and he's just been enabled. So, Ruben, you can come in and ask your question. I don't know if he's mute. Are you going to have to get yourself off mute? I'll ask it for you if we don't hear from you. He was Ruben. I'm going to ask it for you because it's in text form. Are we going to see a big PR push behind the Pacific Deterrence Initiative in terms of reassuring U.S. partners and allies on security?
Yeah, I think so. And it's Pacific Deterrence Initiative. It's also the Maritime Security Initiative that assists countries in Southeast Asia. And I think the answer is yes. I mean, and that is true irrespective of the administration. I mean, the Obama administration famously pivoted to Asia and then changed the term to rebalance to Asia and said, 60% of all of our military assets are now in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, I think it was 59.5% before that. But hey, you got to send a message. And of course, the Trump administration has come back in and come in and said that, in the national defense strategy, China is the number one priority, prioritizing the Pacific. as recently as yesterday or today, put sanctions on Chinese officials for militarization in the South China Sea. So I think what you're going to see is a PR push, but also a military push along several fronts. One is, the kind of buildup of U.S. presence in the region, and the change of that presence toward, so for example, the United States has pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated at the time not just intermediate range nuclear tipped missiles, but conventional missiles, all intermediate range missiles. And, China has 2,000 plus intermediate range missiles. They can fire at Okinawa, they can fire at aircraft carriers, they can fire at Guam, they can fire, other things, and we have none. And so the Pentagon is quickly moving in the direction of trying to look at intermediate range missiles to hold at risk Chinese assets that would have the effect, hopefully, of bolstering deterrence, given that asymmetry. So that's that. So it'll be things like Pacific Deterrence Initiative, but and help to allies and partners. It'll be things in Southeast Asia. It'll be new things like missiles. It'll be other investments, and then that'll also be rooted in this sort of economic approach that you see, which includes sanctions and other things like that.
Okay. And then the other question that Ruben had, which is there going to be any push by moderates to retake the Republican Party? And then we'll go for Catherine Beard, who's going to ask a question as well. So I sort of get the sneaking suspicion that you're a moderate, Richard. So is there sort of some clandestine move to retake the Republican Party?
Yeah, it's funny because in 2016, I would often get the question, not just from our foreign friends, but from folks, in Washington stuff, and they say, "Are you guys going to let Donald Trump be the nominee of your party?" And I got to tell you, there's not actually a back room with with people smoking cigars and like a machine that says where 10 people get together and say well, should the party be moderate or conservative, or should the nominee be Jeb Bush or Donald Trump? I mean, there's these people called voters, and they cast these things called ballots, and they elect people they have nominees. And so I can think whatever I want, and every moderate or internationalist or conservative or populist, they can think whatever they are, but we each only get one vote. And what ultimately determines the tenor of a party and the nominee is who gets the most support. And so, if there were moderates who ran in 2016, they didn't win. Yep. So the Republican Party was not in a moderate, sort of position. And it was different in 2012, it was different in 2008, and things like that. So ultimately it turns on who are the candidates, what are their philosophies, and who triumphs over the others. And that's why I say, we'll know more about the future of the Republican Party on November 3rd. Trump is clearly a nominee, but the difference between, someone who successfully is elected president twice and someone who is elected president once and is not reelected is vast in terms of what the perceived support is for various lines of thought going forward. So you're just going to have to watch this space on that one.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And, the thing that is remarkable about President Trump is that there's 40-odd% of Americans are firmly in behind him. We've got one final question going to Catherine Beard, and she doesn't have her own microphone, so I might have to repeat it. Yeah, so Catherine Beard's question is, after 4 years of Trump presidency, do you feel like you've got any mates in the world, with the European Union and other countries turning their nose up about the United States? So what's your answer to that question?
Well, the answer is yes. There's always a difference between popular opinion. I think I put it in 3 categories: popular opinion, who policymakers would vote for president in the United States for if they could vote in the United States, and then their willingness to actually work with and be allied to and partner with the United States. And those things are always different. And, a good example of this is in the Obama administration, toward the end of the Obama administration, when you know, I would hear from, you know, government officials in Europe and in the Middle East and in Asia quite a lot of frustration with the Obama administration. You know, in the Middle East, the Gulf states didn't like the Iran deal, right? In Europe, you know, they didn't like the non-enforcement of the Syrian red line. In Asia, they thought the pivot to China, or the pivot to Asia, was kind of not full. It was kind of empty, and Obama wasn't tough enough with China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But President Obama's popularity ratings were off the roof in every country. I mean, you know, 85, 90% in Germany and places like that. So there's always a difference between, and you know, Trump is the inverse of that, right? Like, you know, he's, you know, his numbers are terrible and all over the world and stuff like that. But you talk to people, and sometimes, you know, countries in Asia will say, well, you know, all right, some rough edges, don't like a lot of the rhetoric, certainly don't like this jamming us up on, like, you got to pay more for American troops to be stationed in your country. But hey, look, at least the guy's like gotten tough with China and said a bunch of the things that we've been thinking for a while and is trying to express some leadership. Or, you know, in the Middle East, you know, some of the Gulf countries that didn't like the Iran deal like the fact that, you know, the president looks like he's being tough with Iran and things like that. So, you know, at the end of the day, as an American, I would love to have more friends in the world. And I think we should treat our friends better than we have over the past few years, because, you know, if you look at the various competitions we're in, one of our greatest assets is that we have allies all over the world. And as far as I can tell, the demand for America's kind of engagement and leadership in the world still is pretty high. People want what they believe to be the right kind of engagement, but nobody really wants America to just kind of go away most of the time. Yeah. The way, you know, if Russia wasn't a global leader, I don't think anybody would be particularly exercised about that fact. You know, I think that I think we have friends. I think we could treat them better. I think we can improve these relationships. I think we have a lot of latent friends. I think alliance and friend management, it's like what George Shultz said when he was Secretary of State. He said, you know, it's all about tending the garden, right? You know, it's not about calling the friends when you need them. It's about tending the garden and all the relationships you have all over the world, so that if they ever need you, if you ever need them, it's all there for us. And that's what I think we can do a better job of.
I think your point's really well made, and I think if you can look at the New Zealand-US relationship, you have in our government probably one that's not a natural political ally to the Trump administration, but yet when you look at an operational level and you look at Ambassador Scott Brown, very effective relationships with the New Zealand government, and you know, the touch points are actually getting closer and between the United States and New Zealand. So I think you make your point very, very well. At this stage, normally we would ask people to applaud and clap and and thank you for that, because we've got a small crowd, but the crowd, there we go. Richard, we'll send you a bottle of New Zealand wine, which I'm told from the New Zealand wine growers who are here today that sales are up 11% in the United States. So.
Well, you better not say that too loudly. You might get sanctioned. So, you know.
So we'll send you a bottle of New Zealand wine to thank you very much. So thank you on behalf of us. It's wonderful to hear and have a good, solid session with you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you all, and next year in New Zealand. So long.
Thank you.
Stay well, Richard.
Yeah.
Bye.